Hello, everybody. I see people are still coming in. You're all very welcome to this special lunchtime series talk. This is the last talk of the week dealing with the truce from 100 years ago. And our speaker today is somebody I know very well, a fellow Dublin City Council historian in residence, Dr. Mary Muldowney. Mary is based in the Dublin Central area in her work as a historian in residence, and is very passionate about public history. Her research interests include labour and working class history, and she's a committee member of the Irish Labour History Society, and also she's on the Grange Gorman Histories Expert Group and has written various books and publications through the years. And today she's going to be examining an aspect of the truce, which should be very interesting indeed, because she's going to be looking at how this pivotal event from 100 years ago was covered in both the Irish and the international press. So this is the final lunchtime talk then of the week dealing with the truce. And as I mentioned in the chat box at the bottom of the screen there, if you have any questions or comments, you can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen or the chat box, and I'll be able to read them out to Mary after her talk. So you're all very welcome, and I'll hand you over now to Mary to share a screen and sit back and enjoy Mary's talk on the coverage of the truce in the national and international press.
Thanks, James. Okay, this is one of the many talks I've done over the years where I realized as I started to prepare it that I had been enormously overambitious in what I tended to cover in about 45 minutes. So I'm afraid I won't be able to go around the world, but I'll do my best. But, you know, just bearing in mind that this is just a taster really of fascinating stuff out there. So the final months of the Anglo-Irish War, or the War of Independence, as I prefer to call it, saw both sides in the conflict increasing the levels of violence. They'd been escalating through the preceding winter and early spring. Hardliners in the British government, including the Chief Secretary, Sir Hamar Greenwood, whom you see there reviewing some of the auxiliaries, they were advocating complete eradication of separatist forces and any sympathisers. Their faction was confident that Sinn Féin and the IRA would soon be completely defeated, and Greenwood and his supporters adamantly refused to consider a truce until the IRA was fully disarmed. On the other side, hardliners in Sinn Féin were equally reluctant to abandon military operations, despite several significant defeats in this regard and shortages of weaponry. The IRA's attack on the Custom House, which you can see here, which was the centre of local government in Dublin, in May 1921, was insisted on by Eamon de Valera. He was President of the Republic, but was not exactly a military genius, and it was a disaster. Out of over 120 volunteers committed to the operation, none was armed with anything heavier than a pistol or an improvised grenade. When the building was surrounded by heavily armed auxiliaries and British soldiers, 5 guerrillas were killed and 70 to 80 were captured, with only 4 auxiliaries injured. Nevertheless, with the British executing IRA fighters both officially and unofficially after capture, rebel units attacked British soldiers whenever they had the opportunity, whether they were on duty or not. The first batches of Thompson submachine guns arrived in the city at this time and were used in several ambushes in Dublin in June 1921. And if you had listened to Liz Gillis and Cathy Scuffle's fascinating presentation on Tuesday, they would have gone into more detail about how they were used. But there were insufficient weapons in any case in the whole city to make a significant difference. There was a turn towards avoiding combat altogether and destroying British war infrastructure, which was hoped would save more lives on the rebel side. Now, all of this was the background to the visit of King George V to Belfast on the 22nd of June 1921. And it was, I'm not sure actually if my faces blocking the texts there. I'll read it out anyway, but just in case. So it was to open the new Parliament of Northern Ireland. The king had made his unhappiness at the behaviour of the Black and Tans in Ireland very well known to his government. He was also dissatisfied with the official speech that had been prepared for him for the opening, and he apparently consulted the South African Premier General Jan Christian Smuts in revising it. Smuts was an internationalist who was credited with bringing about the Treaty of Vereeniging, which ended the Second Boer War and resulted in the annexation of the South African Republic and the Orange Free State into the British Empire. His background was considered likely to be appealing to Republicans because of his involvement on the Boer side, and it enabled him to act as a go-between at various points later in the year. The final version of the King's speech was delivered in Belfast on 22nd of June, and it was generally well received. It called on, I quote, all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and to forget, and to join in making for the land they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill, end quote, and rather different to Greenwood's approach to things. The king spoke of his affection for Irish people, and he offered not a word of criticism of either Sinn Féin or the IRA. His message instead was mollifying and forward-looking. It appealed to all Irishmen to forgive and forget and to forge, again I quote, a new era of peace, contentment and goodwill, end quote. The Unionist Belfast newsletter reported on the following day, and it effusively welcomed Ulster's new status as an independent state. It said it was a day that can never be forgotten, and it will furnish materials for one of the most readable and instructive pages in the history of the imperial province, which in its political and industrial life has records that reflect with extraordinary force and truth the character of the people. I actually don't know what their I'm sure it's their faith, I think it was, their enterprise and perseverance in industry, and the moral fervour, unfaltering courage and grim determination with which they cling to their political convictions. Generations of them have fought to keep the flag of liberty flying over the province, and today, as a result of their struggles and sufferings and their devotion and tenacity, they have the satisfaction of having their own parliament, which will legislate in accordance with the will of the people and safeguard those eternal principles based on justice and righteousness for which loyalists were prepared to die rather than surrender. The Nationalist Irish News was, not surprisingly, of a very different opinion and less than impressed by the visit and the speech. So their editorial was actually picked up by the Freeman's Journal and quoted, and I've just shown you the Freeman's Journal version there, but it said that the King's speech at the Belfast City Hall is before the public now. It does not justify. It utterly falsifies the hopes of those who believed that he was to figure as a bearer of glad tidings to any part of the country. Mr. Lloyd George's hand is visible in every sentence. The first half is composed of vague professions signifying nothing. At the beginning of the second half, the people of this country are reminded that full partnership in the United Kingdom and religious freedom in the United Kingdom and a religious freedom Ireland has long enjoyed. We know what the partnership in the United Kingdom has brought to our land and nation. And what malevolent sprite in the cabinet concocted that phrase about religious freedom for use within a quarter of a mile of the Belfast shipyards? And that, of course, would be referring to the fact that Catholic workers, those few who were let in, but at that stage after Bloody Sunday on the 10th of July, were being driven out of any access they had to the shipyards. And of course, many people driven from their homes. On the 24th of June 1921, the British coalition government of Liberals and Conservatives decided to propose talks with the president of Sinn Féin, Eamon de Valera, and this was a dramatic reversal of their earlier attitude to the leader. Coalition Liberals and Unionists agreed that an offer to negotiate would strengthen the government's position if Sinn Féin refused. Austin Chamberlain, the new leader of the Unionist Party, said that, quote, the King's speech ought to be followed up as a last attempt at peace before we go the full length of martial law, unquote. It's a great way to go into negotiations, intending not to stick to them. So, seizing the momentum, Lloyd George wrote to Eamon de Valera as the chosen leader of the great majority in Southern Ireland, as he described him. This was on 24th of June, and he suggested a conference. De Valera responded on behalf of Sinn Féin by agreeing to talks. De Valera and Lloyd George ultimately agreed to a truce that was intended to end the fighting and lay the ground for detailed negotiations. Its terms were signed on 9th of July and came into effect on the 11th of July, as we know. Now, I should just say I have read through all of the paper, well, most of the newspapers in English anyway, and their coverage of all of the debate and negotiations going on. And it's absolutely fascinating, but it would have taken several hours to try and reproduce sufficient quotes to give a flavour of it. So I'm just condensing the whole lot for your benefit. But in the course of the War of Independence, politicians like Eamon de Valera, Michael Collins and Arthur Griffiths were fully aware of the need to maintain a strong relationship with the press. Not just the Irish press, but they also felt the need to bring the Irish case for independence to the notice of the rest of the world, particularly the countries that were involved in the nascent League of Nations, which had been launched formally in January 1920, with Britain playing a leading role. The rather grandly named propaganda, sorry, I mistakenly stopped that, I didn't mean to. Resume share. Sorry about that. Flicking the mouse around, you have to be a bit careful. So, as I said, the rather grandly named Dáil Propaganda Department produced the Irish Bulletin, which was a fairly basic looking news sheet and came out several times a week, which was an extraordinary achievement in the middle of a war situation. It gained a reputation for accuracy, especially when it was compared to the official weekly summary, which was issued by Dublin Castle, which even people on the Castle side admitted was mainly black propaganda. The Bulletin's first editor was Desmond Fitzgerald, who was the Dáil's head of propaganda, and this title was changed to head of publicity in the course of the conflict, suggesting that there was an increased self-confidence in the Dáil's own perception of its legitimacy as a government. But the driving force behind the Bulletin was Kathleen McKenna, who was responsible for getting it printed and distributed, which was a great deal harder than it sounds, since the access to printers was literally being shut down several times a week on occasion. The Bulletin was circulated internationally and it presented the Republican point of view. For journalists in Britain and on the continent, it provided a source of information which was an alternative to the Dublin Castle-fed British news agencies. The propaganda department also spread the Republican message in Europe, North America, Canada, Australia, and South Africa. During the revolutionary decade, Irish daily newspapers sold a combined total of around 500,000 copies a day, unhindered by competition from radio or television, or indeed social media, which was come much later. But because newspapers were subject to the control of the military authorities, this led to a certain amount of self-censorship in the national press, just to make sure the papers weren't shut down, and in some cases the editors actually arrested and imprisoned. The powers that gave the military authorities the act that gave them the power to shut down papers that was too obviously sympathetic to the Republican or Nationalist cause was extended under the Defence of the Realm Act, which came in with the start of the First World War and was used regularly. But it was maintained after the war ended in Ireland, and the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act in 1920 excuse me, gave further powers to the military authorities to suppress any newspaper that seemed too sympathetic or too hostile indeed to Dublin Castle. The Irish papers who were being suppressed or involved in expensive court appeals against the restrictions on them were supported quite often by British journalists who condemned this form of censorship. And I suppose they could see that, you know, if it was applied in Ireland, it could also be applied elsewhere. And certainly at that stage, the British Empire was fairly wide-ranging in its control of different countries. So the Irish Times in Dublin then represented the Irish Unionist viewpoint for the most part. So it generally reported the official version. The other principal Irish newspapers had to tread a fine line between reporting the truth and the danger of official suppression. They always condemned IRA violence, and they mostly reported fairly on Sinn Féin activities, but they also revealed the violence of the Crown forces. And in the final weeks before the truce commenced on the 11th of July in 1921, you could see increasing criticism of the Dublin Castle administration and a much more sympathetic coverage of Sinn Féin activities than they would have risked even a year earlier. So on 24th of June, Lord George had invited Eamon de Valera and James Craig, the Northern Ireland Premier, to go to London to explore the possibility of a settlement. In response, de Valera called a conference for 4th of July in Dublin to discuss Lloyd George's proposal for London talks. Craig refused to come. De Valera, or spokesman of the nation as he described himself, met the Southern Unionists at the Mansion House in Dublin. Another meeting was held on July 8th. General Macready, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in Ireland, met de Valera in the Mansion House and terms for a truce were agreed. And if you heard the presentation on Wednesday, Micheál McDonagh was describing how Macready came in really at the invitation of Lawrence O'Neill, who was the Dublin Lord Mayor, and very sympathetic to separatism, but even more determined to support democracy and try and keep people safe. So, although the truce didn't actually start formally until noon on Monday, 11th of July, as I had told you earlier, there was intense coverage of its terms over the preceding weekend in both Northern Ireland and what was described as Southern Ireland in the Government of Ireland Act 1920, which had given rise to the partition of the country. There was a general welcome for the prospect of peace in the Southern newspapers, but the Northern Unionist newspapers were frequently more equivocal in their approach to what was going on. In a report headed "In the Heart of Down," with subheadings of Archdeacon and Ireland and government's inconsistency, the Belfast Telegraph of the 13th of July reported, The chairman declared that having accepted a parliament of their own, they were going to make the best of it and were not going to allow any man to filch it from them. The recent action of Mr. Lloyd George was the first in the history of the world, when the Prime Minister of England got down on his knees to a rebel. For in reality, Mr. Lloyd George was praying to the rebels to give peace to England. Shame, you can imagine the shouts and the catcalls. So the chairman went on to say, while they had absolute confidence in their Ulster leaders, yet it was desirable that that large demonstration and all like it should send a message to those leaders, telling them that no matter what they did or said, the rank and file of the Orange institution would never bow down to rebels, traitors, murderers, or anything of the sort. And again, loud applause. So you can see in the cartoon here some of the attitudes. I mean, this is an appallingly racist cartoon. De Valera, of course, with the old-style German army helmet, presuming, associating the Republicans with the Germans, even though this was after the war ended. And Carson, looking rather glum. He had been recently promoted to be Lord Carson in the House of Lords. And Joe Devlin, who was one of the, I think he was Belfast, for the Irish Parliamentary Party and a nationalist, but by no means in favour of brute force as is suggested here. And we'll say nothing about Ireland being a pig. So really the lengthy report, I should go back a bit, went on to detail various resolutions in the same defiant mode, all apparently greeted with loud applause, including one proposal that in future all unionists had to be members of the Orange Order. Reports followed from other gatherings and meetings celebrating the memory of William of Orange and the ascendancy of Protestantism. One speaker, a Reverend W. Bigley, MA, had proposed a resolution declaring loyal devotion to the principles of the Orange Institution, which was unanimously adopted. Now, the Irish Times, as I said, had been staunchly unionist in its coverage of the War of Independence. And while the editorial on 11th of July acknowledged that the people of Dublin, at least, were delighted to show their appreciation of the terms, the analysis from the paper was rather grudging about the bona fides of the Republicans. So the truce from warfare in Ireland will begin today at noon. But it was anticipated on Saturday and yesterday by the spirit of truce. A walk in the streets of Dublin or in any country road revealed the immense satisfaction and relief which the good news had brought to all hearts. There's no essential difference between the terms of the truce as announced by General Headquarters in Dublin and by the leaders of the Irish Republican Party. During the anxious days of the Dublin Conference, we refrained from any mention of the inevitable result of the failure of peace negotiations. We should have continued to refrain now that negotiation has been transferred to London, for in these days the most obvious advice or warning is liable to be misconstrued. This was not saying that the British government would misunderstand. So he went on. What the editorial went on to say, naturally, we do not accept his, talking about De Valera's way of looking at the matter, when he says that if force is resumed against the Republican army, it must be ready once more to resist. We prefer to say that if the London Conference comes to nothing, and if Sinn Féin renews the campaign of violence, the government will be compelled to resume its efforts to restore law and order. Not really all that different a position from the hardline Conservatives in London. So De Valera did agree to travel to London, though not immediately. First, he decided to convene a conference in Dublin with representatives of the political minority, of which Sir James Craig and Lord Middleton were among the invitees. The Cork Examiner prematurely trumpeted that the Irish conference to be held at the Mansion House, which you see here in the crowds outside, would be as momentous as ever was held in the history of this country. Unfortunately, the big billing proved unfounded, but this was not least because Craig refused to come to Dublin. The Mansion House gathering on 4th of July did accelerate a momentum towards peace, however. It started a flurry of political activity on both sides of the Irish Sea, with Lord Middleton, who did attend at the Mansion House, conveying to Lord George the necessity of agreeing to an armistice before De Valera would consider travelling to London. So General Smuts, acting as an unofficial intermediary, also met Sinn Féin leaders in Dublin on the 5th of July, and he too reported back to the British cabinet on the need for a truce as a precondition to a conference in London. So when Lord Middleton returned to the Mansion House on the 8th of July, he did so with the Prime Minister's agreement to an unconditional truce, something to which the British government had been absolutely unwilling to accede in the previous December. So a measure of the mood of expectancy and relief in Ireland, and especially in Dublin, can be given by the reception given to General Macready, who you can see here as he arrived by car at the Mansion House. Now you can see that he had a pistol and apparently it was loaded, so he wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he's been greeted by Lawrence O'Neill, who generally was trusted on all sides as being a man who had unquestionable integrity. But there were cheers from the crowd for the general, who, after all, had been heading up the British forces, so it was an unlikely change of pace. Several papers noted that the commander of the British forces in Ireland was actually cheered by the huge crowds. And the sheer incongruity of this scene was remarked upon by the Daily Express newspaper, which optimistically reported that it seemed that the last chapter of bloodshed and misery has at length been closed. But after praising the efforts of De Valera, Griffith, Lord Middleton, and the other unionist representatives at the Mansion House, the final word, well, at that point, came from the Irish Independent, which was Ireland's largest selling daily newspaper, and it was very buoyant in its approach. It said the nation has undergone a period of travail and agony, but given a really satisfactory settlement which can be accepted with honour, lasting reconciliation, accompanied by domestic contentment and prosperity, will follow. It's rather sad when you think that a year later, what we were embroidered, but anyway, I'm jumping ahead of myself. You see here Smuts, who had, as I said, come to Ireland and came on several occasions. And I think in the course of the year, he was elected Premier of South Africa. So he did have other things in his mind. And he was also going to the peace conference in Paris. So a very busy man. This is Sir Alfred Cope, who was the Deputy Undersecretary for Ireland, and a man who seemed determined to bring about peace if he possibly could. But certainly there were many reports at the time from his own colleagues accusing him of being a Republican sympathizer simply because he was trying to bring about the end of the violence. So international news outlets had been following the story of the Irish struggle for independence from Britain to a level that was unprecedented since the years of the Great Famine. Attention had been stepped up dramatically, I suppose naturally enough, after the 1916 Rising and subsequent years, and it continued until the ending of the Civil War in 1923. It was to be expected that interest from British newspapers would be acute, although perhaps not the levels of support for the nascent republic and its proponents in the wake of the truce and the lead up to the treaty negotiations. Many of the British papers really did an about face. The news of the truce was welcomed, albeit with reservations in some newspapers. But on the 10th of July 1921, the government supporting Sunday Times stressed the need for the Sinn Féin leadership to control the rank and file. And they wanted volunteers who might not be in favour of a ceasefire to be kept very much under control. It said irreconcilables who may defy the leaders will no longer be patriotic criminals, but criminals pure and simple. Future generations may recognise that the past 2 years' misery, well, would have said it was rather more, may have been necessary to the realisation that the North and South must compel their differences if they continue to live. And the next day, the Times, I couldn't find their account of the Belfast riots, the Bloody Sunday as it was called, on the 10th of July, but it was reported mainly on late on the 10th and into the 11th and subsequent days. It's, the eve of truce battle. It's described in the Daily News because, of course, the truce was to stop at lunchtime. But Unionist rioting had started on the Sunday, and snipers shot various people, just innocents going about their various daily business in the Catholic areas. Eventually, there were 16 deaths. There were 14 on the day, and 2 people died later. And more than 1,000 people lost their homes because they were evicted in a pogrom. And the story in the Daily News that you see here was similar to other coverage, and it lasted for several days as the violence continued, which is probably one of the reasons that if there was going to be any pushback on the terms of, from the British government on the terms of the truce, that they were likely to see a lot of international pressure, because as the fatalities and the reprisals from the British government had increased during 1920 and into 1921, interest in Ireland around the world had grown, but especially in Britain. And many British, American and European journalists and other more international arrived in Dublin to see for themselves what was going on. And many of these people contacted Sinn Féin, who treated them very well. There was also the appeal of gaining access to clandestine interviews with leading Republican figures. And people will remember how this worked during the Northern Ireland troubles in the 60s, 70s and 80s. So initially, much of the press in Britain reported the official version with little interpretation. And they basically said it was a police war against the criminal conspiracy of the, quote, Sinn Féin murder gang. Some papers like the Manchester Guardian and the Daily News took an independent view and became increasingly critical of government policy on Ireland. Many presented the IRA violence as wrong, but came to see it as a consequence of misgovernment and repression. As 1920 merged into 1921, unease was growing in Britain about what was being done in the name of the people. So the news from Ireland was absolutely scandalous to public opinion, especially something like the situation in Belfast. And this totally undermined the notion of the British Empire as a global civilizing force. And so even as the Chief Secretary, Hamer Greenwood, was stonewalling Parliament, denying press accounts of atrocities, a cabinet member wrote of his colleagues that the sensational press reports in Ireland was upsetting their nerves, particularly because of its likely impact on public opinion in the United States. Some American journalists had taken particular interest in Ireland, notably a man called Francis Hackett, who was a columnist with, I suppose we'd call it left-leaning New Republic. still exists and is still an independent voice in American journalism. But Hackett gave regular free talks to the public in the US on the Irish question. He was also very widely syndicated. He'd been born in Kilkenny but moved to the US in 1901. And the piece I want to quote from here is from one of his, I suppose, lighter analysis. It was written for Harpers Bazaar, which was a magazine rather than a newspaper. But it was trying to explain the Irish question to American readers and how difficult it would be to resolve the problems in the country. Sorry. And it was called Why Belfast is Still Paved. Belfast is a city apart from the rest of Ireland. Underneath the apparent business-like exterior of this semi-American city, there is a heat of political and religious passion that reminds one of East St. Louis. The Sinn Féiners are in a compact religious, social and economic minority. The community as a whole is definitely unionist, mercantile and Presbyterian. The stranger does not need to make a single inquiry as to the existence of passion. All he needs is to take any streetcar and then, as he travels from the centre, look up and down the cross streets. In front of countless Belfast dwellings, he'll observe a little mound of paving stones. And they are known as kidneys. These have been gathered up since the last row and are waiting for the next one. They're known as kidneys. Some quotes. And the pocketfuls of bolts which the shipyard workers bring home with them to use as ammunition are known as Belfast butterflies or confetti. Up and down the thoroughfares on which the streetcars run, the loose bricks and stones pepper the asphalt for miles. It is a battlefield several times a year. And I found a brilliant photograph of the Belfast streets in 1921. Now, it wasn't just the unionist areas, but it tended to be a bit more obvious there. And you can just see all of the kidneys and the butterflies and the confetti scattered on the footpaths after the latest row. So to remove temptation, he went on to write, the Municipal Council of Belfast once thought it would pass an ordinance to pave the whole of the city with asphalt. To this same proposition, both sides heartily agreed. Then the question arose with which quarter to begin. Naturally, the majority in the corporation decided to begin with the Nationalists or Sinn Féiners. At this prospect, the whole fighting Sinn Féin community revolted. Were they going to be deprived of their sole means of self-defence while Orange Belfast still had millions of cobblestones? They'd die first. So Belfast is still corrugated with ammunition. And given the size of the Irish diaspora in the United States, it really wasn't surprising that events in Ireland were followed closely. But the fascination with the Irish War of Independence was also evident in the press coverage from many other countries across the world. On 10th of July, just after before the truce was formally to begin, but after it had been announced in the newspapers, the Boston Post outlined the terms of the truce as they were reported in the Irish Bulletin. Now, the source of the report was obviously a clear indication of the preferences of the paper, as it described the Irish Bulletin as the organ of Dáil Éireann, apparently accepting the publication as the legitimate outlet of the Government of Ireland, since Dublin Castle was not quoted either here or in other US newspapers that covered the report from the Bulletin. Now, I haven't gone through every single one of them because they had an amazing number of newspapers at that time, but mainly they do seem to have picked up the Bulletin's release rather than anything from Dublin Castle or even from London. So it wasn't simply a reflection of the large Irish community in Boston. And some of the papers I was rather surprised by because they wouldn't have been obviously aligned to anyone, but the didn't necessarily carry their news from the Dublin Castle Publicity Bureau. They were getting it from international news agencies. And just to give you an idea of the geographic spread of some of these papers, they included the New York Herald, the Chattanooga Daily Times, the Albuquerque Journal, the West Palm Beach Post, the Catholic Tribune of St. Joseph, Missouri, the St. Louis Globe Democrat, the Salt Lake Telegram, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Los Angeles Times, among hundreds of others across the length and breadth of the United States, from small towns to large cities. The Canadian newspapers expressed some caution about the likely stability of the truce. Given Canada's status as a member of the Commonwealth, it is not surprising that their quoted sources were well established, that their quoted sources were Dublin Castle or Ulster Unionists. The Orange Order was very well established across Canada, as this photograph from Toronto March for the 12th, I think it was 1920. It shows, I mean, that's as big a crowd as you'd have gotten in Belfast or Derry or elsewhere. The Montreal Gazette and the Vancouver Sun, on opposite ends of the country, sides of the country, seem to have used the same report on attitudes in Ulster for their assessment of the likely success of the De Valera Lloyd George conference. They were, sounded exactly the same. And in the editorial, it said, in a case of hands off with Orange men on the Lloyd George De Valera conference, declared John Gordon of the Ulster Ministry in a speech at Larne, County Antrim today. Mr. Lord George might be prepared to enter into conferences with De Valera to settle affairs in Ireland, said Mr. Gordon, but Orange men had settled the affairs of Ulster. And to Messrs. Lord George and De Valera, they said, hands off. So, excuse me, the Vancouver Sun, as I said, was almost word for word with the report. And they reported that Canadian Dominion status would be the model for Ireland, with Ulster being treated like Quebec in terms of its special position in the country. However, this analysis was queried by other newspapers who considered that the involvement of General Smuts in discussions with Lord Middleton as advisor to the British government meant that it was much more likely that the South African solution would be the one applied in Ireland. And of course, neither view took into account that Northern Ireland was now in existence as a separate state, and that the overwhelming electoral mandate for Sinn Féin in the 1920 elections in Southern Ireland, as it still was, made it clear that the people in the South had little appetite for continuing subjugation to the British Empire. On the other side of the world, in Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald reported on the 11th of December that De Valera and Lloyd George were meeting in conference in London, and they reproduced the letter of invitation from Lloyd George and De Valera's response. Both were cautious, obviously wanting to encourage the coming together of the two sides, but careful not to preempt acceptance of the truce by the IRA, since the paper was published ahead of the agreed commencement at midday on 11th of July in British and Irish time. But the report referred to the crowds outside the Mansion House in Dublin who were reciting rosaries for the success of the conference. And the only negative response to the news of the truce was contained in a brief report of an intervention by Archbishop Mannix of Melbourne, which was dated the 8th of July. It said the Chicago Tribune's correspondent in Tokyo, you can see the global nature of this, reports that Archbishop Mannix has arrived in Japan. He visited the sister of Terence McSweeney, late Lord Mayor of Cork, who was a teacher in a local convent. The Archbishop said there can be no truth in any report of peace in Ireland unless the British government announces complete Irish independence. Now, It's not clear whether Mannix was speaking for Mary McSweeney at this point, because obviously she became a fervent anti-treatyite in 1922, or whether this was his personal view, or both. But his position was unlikely to attract support in Australia. In the previous year, Terence McSweeney's 74-day hunger strike in Brixton had attracted huge attention around the world, culminating with his death on the 25th of October 1920. An Australian member of Parliament, Hugh Mahon, who was originally from Ireland, was expelled from the Australian Parliament for seditious and disloyal utterances at a public meeting after he protested in Parliament against the actions of the British government in their treatment of McSweeney. Mahon had been in favour of Home Rule when he was still in Ireland, but until reports of the violence of the War of Independence and the actions of the British forces in his home country changed his opinion to demanding complete independence. He was expelled from Parliament and said for seditious behaviour. And in December, 2 months later, there was an election in Australia and he lost his seat. And this suggests that his criticism of the British government wasn't appreciated by the Australian electorate any more than by his fellow parliamentarians. So as I said earlier, the global coverage of Ireland's revolution years was intense, but I've only referred to English language newspapers today. Oliver O'Hanlon has a fascinating piece in one of my favourite books, The Atlas of the Irish Revolution, in which he describes some of the European reports and, most interestingly, their use of imagery to enhance their analysis, which was almost uniformly sympathetic to Ireland. In these days of, sorry, I keep doing these things. These days of almost instantaneous news feeds and multiple media outlets, I'm not sure that we really appreciate what a vital role newspapers played 100 years ago. Correspondents were certainly helped by the availability around the turn of the century and onwards of telegrams and telephones, but they were still hampered by distance and slower modes of travel. And I've barely skimmed the surface of the newspaper world in the early 20th century, but it was as important then as the internet is now. So thank you for listening. And as James said, if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat box or the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Mary, for that fascinating talk. And I'll just notice there's a question straight away from Alison in the Q&A box. And if anybody else has any questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A box. You can also enter any comments in the chat box as well, if you like.
Can I just say hello to Alison? I know her, she's in England, and a fantastic knowledge of Irish history.
Yes, if I'm not mistaken, she's a participant, or has been a participant for the last few months of my Irish Revolution course that I
she did my one last year.
So she probably knows more than all of us together.
Exactly.
And she's very impressed. She says, brilliant webinar, Mary. Thank you. And she wants to know if you can recommend the best source, free if possible, for reading the international newspapers referred to during your presentation today.
The free part is difficult. You can get them free, but Alison said lives in England. So Dublin City Library and Archives, when it's open, which hopefully it will be again soon, please, you have free access to the various databases. But unfortunately, all of the others, there is a fee of some sort. You can read the Irish newspapers online, which I think is about €30 a year, maybe slightly less, and Ancestry, aka newspapers.com, own the rest of it as far as I know. So if you go on to their sites, they the search engines are excellent, the layout is really good, but you are paying for it. And I have a terrible habit of just putting my credit card details in and not really remembering what it is, and then what's this monthly thing coming out? Anyway, unfortunately, I'm not aware outside libraries here that there is a free source, unfortunately.
Okay, and I remember when I was in America, I had a couple of fellowships in America back in 2015 and 2016, and I remember there was a free website for American newspapers. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I remember there was an incredible amount of newspapers that you could search state by state and city by city in terms of American newspapers. So I think if you look around, you can find some databases, but unfortunately, most of them you have to pay for, like the Irish Newspaper Archives. Now, I see a question from Mark. He notes that there was not much forgiving and forgetting being displayed on Belfast's Bloody Sunday. Was this just an outrageous attempt at destroying the truce, or was there more to it?
I think, certainly it was focused on the truce, but anger at the fact of the truce rather than trying to destroy it. It was much more that, the confidence that came from now having their own state, which was very much on loyalist orange lines, if you like. And of course, the bitter religious sectarianism that had been encouraged for so many years. So most of the people who were driven out, the Catholics who were driven out of their home, they were from working class areas. And that was the case with so many of the various pogroms. I mean, there wasn't an awful lot of class solidarity in the North until later with the workers' movement in the early 30s. But, and even that broke apart fairly quickly because really, the story of how the unionist parties and the Orange Order to a great extent actually manipulated ordinary people on the ground. It's repeated in so many countries where an elite class has manipulated people who have no power to put the blame for the situation on similar people who just happen to have maybe different color skin or a different religious background or whatever it is. And that, I think that was more the case.
And there's something that I was curious about, was the cartoon that you showed earlier featuring De Valera and Carson and Lloyd George and Joe Devlin. It was a wonderful cartoon. I've never seen that one before. I think the artist, if I'm not mistaken, is an English artist, was Leo Cheney, I believe.
Yes, yeah, and that one was actually circulated very widely at the time. I'm not entirely sure, I didn't put a caption in because I found it online, as we're having to do most things at the moment, and I'm not sure where it originally appeared, but since he's dead, I figure he's not going to sue me.
And another question just about the Custom House, because this was something that came up yesterday in Cormac Moore's presentation about the Custom House, and I know historians have differed through the years about whether or not it was a failure or a great victory for the Republican movement. You were mentioning that it was a pretty disastrous event in your mind about the burning of the Custom House and how it unfolded for the Republican forces.
I think, I mean, I know there is disagreement, and I'm also not a fan of De Valera, as it might have crept in, but I do think the fact of his insistence, as he had done on other occasions, on a kind of a full-face conventional fight was so ridiculous, and the fact of so many arrests and deaths and injuries, it did leave the Dublin brigades decimated. That they had to have a rethink of what they were going to do. Now, Laz Fallon will tell all the great stories about how the burning was kept going by the IRA members of the Dublin Brigade, who were not exactly putting fires out as they went in. and that they possibly helped some volunteers to escape. But in the short term, it was a disaster. That it was possibly the timing of various other things, and however awful it was, certainly the things like the Belfast pogrom on the 10th of July and other events would have speeded up Lloyd George's intention to get into negotiations. However, maybe duplicitous he was being about the extent to which he would honour what he knew the Irish side wanted.
Okay, well, I think that's it. We're just coming up to 2 o'clock, so this is perfect timing. I'll just mention that I've done a short talk about the Truce plaque, which is outside the Dublin Mansion House, and you can access that short presentation on the DCC Historians and Residents Facebook page. So yes, that wraps up today's talk and our full week of lunchtime talks dealing with the truce. I would just like to thank Stephanie for helping with the admin side of hosting the event here today. Of course, to Dr. Mary Muldowney for her fascinating presentation today on the coverage in the national and international press of the truce. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you over the coming months for more public history events courtesy of Dublin City Libraries. So thanks very much to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, James. Bye.
Bye, everybody.